why is metaphor so central to nonfiction writing? Well, think about what a merely objective account, merely factual account of you would amount to. Um, just what can be absolutely objectively said about you. It would amount to, kind of like a missing persons description. You're so tall, your um, eyes are a certain color, you're a certain weight, or whatever. Um, in other words, it would be a description of you by somebody who doesn't know you. And to say um, that someone doesn't know you, that means to say they don't know what you're like. They're not familiar with you. This goes back to that distinction that Ian McGilchrist talks about between different kinds of knowing, objective knowing and being familiar with, having something like a family relationship with. That means being which means sharing a sense of likeness. So in this class, we've looked at, stories about what it's like to be, marginalized by history, by race, by gender, to feel, as Ta-Nehisi Coates puts it, or Rebecca Solnit, shrouded, suffocated, silenced. And communicating what your reality is like is a matter of reproducing that reality. And it's also a matter of perpetuating a certain kind of media of communication. Media of communication is media of reproduction, the media of paint, the media of film, of writing itself, the mythology that animates and colors our experience of nature, all the writers that inspired Cheryl Strayed. The Book of Eels is about the author's relationship to eels, of course, but thereby also his family and, to history. The eel is a reflection of his self at the end of chapter 4. When Dad talked about the Sargasso Sea, it sounded like a magical fairy tale world, or like the end of the world. I pictured mile after mile of open sea that suddenly turned into a blanket of seaweed teeming with life and movement, and eels around one another dying and sinking to the ocean floor, while tiny see-through willow leaves floated up toward the light and let the invisible current take them. Every time we caught an eel, I looked into his eyes, trying to catch a glimpse of what it had seen. None of them ever met my gaze. So I think in a way the book is about learning to see his gaze returned precisely through the eel's elusiveness. The eel becomes the secret becomes his own, as he says in that book's final sentence. Precisely by keeping it secret. That secret is his relation to life. Is his relation to himself. Life always exists, as Emerson puts it, in the transition from a past to a new state. Not just for Matthew McConaughey, but for all of us. We're always existing in this moment of transition, shooting the goal, darting to an aim. You can't hold life frozen in the way in which objective representation would imply. This is what the world hates, as Emerson puts it, that the soul becomes, that forever degrades the past. We're always living, whatever we say and want to hold objectively in representation, um, is belied by the fact that we live on into the future, that we continue becoming. Emerson likewise says in that same essays on self-reliance, we shun the rugged battle of fate. Looking at Svensson's prose style, I think you'll notice there are a number of repetitions, phrases that recur. Um, so I encourage you to think about that. One of them is there are circumstances that force us to choose what to believe. And I think this is a nice um, way of putting this contrast between fact and fate. Circumstances, it's another word for facts, details of circumstance. And the way he puts it is ambiguous. There are circumstances that force us to choose what to believe. It's as if there are some circumstances that force us to choose what to believe. That's the way we first read it, such as the eel. That's one circumstance. Then there are other circumstances. The implication is then there are other circumstances that don't force belief. But again, I think is one of the effects of the book as you go along is to sort of realize that no, it's circumstances in general. It's not, there aren't just some weird things. It's innately mysterious. Circumstances per se force us to choose what to believe. Another nicely ambiguous formulation is what he says about the Sargasso Sea. He says I think in the second sentence of the book, it's a place in every respect suitable to the creation of eels. When I think when you first read it, you think, oh, okay, so he's going to explain to us how it's suitable, like what makes it suitable. But as you read through the book, you realize that he's proposing a different perspective on the same sentence. We know that it's absolutely suitable, but we don't know why. We don't understand the respects, how that is. We just know that it's absolutely, in every respect, suitable. Do you get that difference? The way Svensson talks about the Sargasso Sea and eels reminds me of John Keats's famous poem Ode on a Grecian Urn, where he's looking at this urn. This is a drawing he made of it, looking at the different figures and sort of wondering about what the life that they depict. He's wondering what was these musicians and lovers and depiction of some kind of religious ritual sacrifice, and he wonders what was that. He's wondering about this sort of non-fictional representation on the urn. His reply is, I don't know, and I don't want to know. The most information it has to communicate is the mystery itself. That's all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. I think Svensson is making a very similar point about the eel. Keats famously says about the musicians he sees on here, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Mystery, what we don't know, tells us more about ourselves, If we knew it entirely, that would drain it of its information, right? About, it's useful information for living our own lives. Keats concludes by calling the vase cold pastoral, cold because of its refusal to communicate. It does tease us out of thought as doth eternity. I think Svensson feels quite the same way about the eel, you know. Teases us out of thought, and that's what's liberating. That's what makes it useful, is it teases us out of that need to understand. And that's what makes it, Keats calls a friend to man. That's what makes it familiar, knowable in that sense of connaître, the familiar sense of intimate kinship. That's what makes it family. The mystery becomes a family mystery. Passing down this mystery across history is what holds us together, you know. What sustains a kind of family or friendship, kinship, a knowing in the sense of familiarity, a family bond across history, across the generations. It's a mutual mystery. And that's just how Svensson describes the eel, describes the history of trying to understand the mystery of the eel, that for so long was understood to be a number of different species rather than one species that undergoes these different stages of metamorphosis. It was perceived as several different species whose reproduction was mysterious. Insofar as its troubles, complicates, mystifies our conception of life and death. You know, it seems to live in states that seem like death. It seems capable of hibernating in states that seem inert. You know, and that's why for so long it seemed capable of spontaneous generation just out of the dirt, because it's able to hibernate for so long, to just kind of close down metabolic function. Svensson describes how the eel continues to move after it should be dead. You know, after its head's been removed, or even after its skin's been removed, or it's, you know, cooking on the stove. Uses really uncanny, or uses language to uncanny effect. Like, he describes the movement as sluggish, or he says after he removes the skin, the eel seems to calm down and twitch less, you know, spasmodically. Just this kind of weird, you know, zombie in between life and death. And the fact is that it still remains a kind of mystery to science. The reproduction and death of the eel has not, you know, been empirically described. Inhabits Europe, the center of civilization, you know, since the beginning, you know, Aristotle, and yet it reproduces in this very specific place that defies the Sargasso Sea, that defies our scrutiny. So what I would want to emphasize here is that in addition to, you know, the loss, every species, of course, is a loss. To the diversity, the qualitative diversity of the planet, of nature. But the eel is a very specific index of diversity, or metaphor for diversity per se. It teaches us in a qualitatively, you know, uniquely rich and suggestive way diversity means, what it means to be teased out of thought in Keats's terms. This diagram shows uh, the different life forms, and in particular the hypothesis. What's it? This hypothetical period of imprinting. Um, the hypothesis is that during this glass eel stage, the eel is imprinted with a kind of awareness of the magnetic force of tides, and it's this imprinting that the eel carries with it, and guides it back to its spawning grounds in the Sargasso Sea. Um, so just kind of just mind-bending complexity. This edge environment, echo tone that I mentioned earlier, of brackish water between salt water and fresh water. This metamorphic stage of life is in tune to the magnetic force of tides. I mean, it's just so wild to contemplate. I think this idea of imprinting is a really good way of thinking about systemic causation in the reality of an environmental context in which everything is interlaced with everything else. So it's impossible to isolate without artificially distorting. It's impossible to isolate discrete causal relationships. But you can speak about systemic patterns of causations. Patterns in the environment describe reality, but they can't be reduced to simple causal relationships that our language requires. Another example of metaphorical imprinting, or the power of a kind of metaphorical imprinting, is Rebecca Solnit's discussion of the way in which the term motherhood is sort of politically mobilized, made politically powerful, discussing the kind of traumatic circumstances of fascism in Argentina. She talks about how this activist group of mothers appropriate the category of motherhood as a kind of covering to communicate an awareness of the trauma. No longer just a simple direct cause of reproduction, producing the species, but as a metaphor, it becomes a means of a new kind of politics, a cover for a new kind of politics, a costume. The role was a screen behind which they had a limited kind of freedom of movement in a system in which no one was truly free. This covering, represents obliteration, trauma, silencing, but it also represents a mobilization, an expressive mobilization of the medium itself, the paint and the canvas. That's what I've tried to suggest about metaphors and the formal properties of Ta-Nehisi Coates' language, evoking the body, in language. So trying to detach racism from the abstract conceptuality, and reconnect it with a kind of embodied mediation in the formal properties of his prose. It's kind of a prose of embodied violence, but it has a distinctive kind of poetics to it. Dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. This is a kind of mimicking of the texture of animated, embodied, sensuous life, the vulnerability of actual flesh. Here are the transparent glass eels that I was just talking about, are responsible for this imprinting of the tidal magnetism that ultimately leads them back to the spawning. After these, subsequent stages of metamorphosis, and even decades of time can lead them back to their spawning grounds. This image, again, it's so suggestive of this kind of patterning um, uh, that defies linear narratives, such as the kind of scientific understanding of reproduction that the eel so long and continues to defy. In the chapter on Freud, there's an interesting quotation of Freud's description of the eels he's working on, which are in this later stage, but he's trying to find the reproductive organs, which don't appear until this final stage when the eel is already migrating back to sea. So for so long, this freshwater eel was studied and baffled scientists that no reproductive organs were ever found. But there's a way in which I think we can hear in Freud's prose a kind of materialist poetics, like I was talking about in Ta-Nehisi Coates, and that Rebecca Solnit talks about in this painting. This passage is framed by Svensson's discussion of Freud's sexual confusion. So his search for the reproductive organs of the eel kind of overlap with his own struggle of sexual self-understanding. Freud doesn't find any eel testicles, and he gradually grows more frustrated. Every night at 6:30, he takes a walk through the narrow alleyways of Trieste, past shops and restaurants toward the sea, where the setting sun turns the water into a mirror, hiding all life underneath the surface. He hears dock workers speaking German, Slovenian, and Italian, smells the spices and coffee, sees the fishermen pack up the last of their catch, sees the women with their make-up eyes moving toward the bars in the square. He sees all that and thinks about eels. I'm quoting from his letter. Freud writes, "My hands are stained by the white and red blood of the sea creatures. All I see when I close my eyes is the shimmering dead tissue which haunts my dreams. And all I can think about are the big questions, the ones that go hand in hand with testicles and ovaries, the universal pivotal questions." I can't help but think about, Dr. Frankenstein and that manipulating the dead flesh and contemplating the secret of life. What strikes me there is the shimmering dead tissue. The word shimmering is so evocative of this kind of patterning. It's a onomatopoeia, like murmuring, shimmering, or glittering, glimmering. The words that evoke this pattern of flickering, another word, this rhythmic pattern is a kind of animation. It's a poetics of animation, a similar kind of rhythm to the rhythm of Ta-Nehisi Coates' prose. I want to juxtapose here this sort of networking, patterning, systemic causation, systemically animating the medium itself, flickering of the sheet, thinking about the imprinting of tidal magnetism on each on these individual creatures. Bafflingly complex kind of interactive patterns that are in play there. Again, I think the point is not to understand that, but instead, precisely the opposite, to let its incomprehensibility baffle your mind and provide you with awe-inspiring awareness of the material complexity of, of nature, of the world. We are emotionally imprinted by what we don't understand. That's what Alison Gopnik calls the separate intelligence, the separate learning style of children. Imprinting by the environment that informs and organizes, arranges behavior on, again, a systemic level. That's precisely how Svensson describes the eel in his own personal story, as a kind of emotional imprinting that gives his life a kind of orientation. What I'm talking about in this description, the interplay of memory and grief and fear as the dad is dying. Svensson recounts a memory of an episode that itself brings back a memory from much more earlier in his childhood. That's uncanny. Hope you get a sense in this description of this narrative as of a kind of patterning, interlacing. So they're sitting watching TV as his dad is suffering from the cancer that'll kill him, although he doesn't know it yet. "Have you been fishing?" his dad asks. And that's when I realized his eyes looked different. The whites had gone yellow, had acquired a grayish yellow tone, like an old sheet of paper that had turned dirty and matte. The yellow surrounded his black pupils like a thick fog. I looked him in the eyes for a split second, and I must have reacted somehow, because he looked away and turned back to the TV. I sat next to him in silence, staring straight ahead without really knowing what had just happened. That's really amazing. I mean, again, it's like that event, that split second of sharing a glance, like, confuses causal explanation. Did I look away, or did he look away? This confused but supercharged emotional experience. The causal, retracing it causally is impossible. But it just gets more deeply enmeshed in emotion and memory as he proceeds. We talked some more, but each time I looked at him, it was as if he were trying to avoid my gaze. He turned his head away as though hiding something from me, and I remembered a time when I was little and we were sitting around the kitchen table. It was in the middle of winter and snowy and cold outside. Dad was wearing a yellow knit hat with a blue crown on it, and when he took it off, the skin of his forehead was the same shade of yellow as the hat. "I've got jaundice," he said and chuckled, but I didn't understand that it was a joke. I asked Mum what jaundice was, and she said it was a disease of the liver and that it could be fatal, and I went scared and quiet. I thought Dad was dying, and I had no words to express my fear. Then he laughed and explained he was kidding and it was just the hat rubbing off on him. I didn't dare to believe it. I had realized that if other people could fall ill and even die, then why not my dad? Why not me? I think that's pretty amazing. It reminds me of that video I showed you of that climber talking about the most scared he's ever been was when he thought his daughter got hurt falling down the stairs, when she actually hadn't. But he says when he remembers fearing that, he still gets scared, even though it never happened. It didn't actually. Nothing bad actually happened. And likewise here, um, he's Svensson is describing seeing his dad actually ill, but what the kind of actual deep emotional pain, what's most disturbing about it is kind of revealed by this memory of thinking he was sick when he or had jaundice, this weird mistaken conception when he was a little boy. Um, and I really relate to that. I think, and it suggests, how our our emotional life, again, doesn't fit neat causal explanations or rationality. The way our fears are what makes us sad um, goes back to real deep kind of feelings that you know tend to recur in these uncanny ways, um, it's confusing ways. These confusing mysteries bring us closer to our emotional truth, our emotional reality, than rational causal explanations would. Indeed, quite on the contrary, um, reasoning them out, giving them a linear explanation, rationalizing them um, would, uh, dissolve the reality. Ask yourself what the reality is, the emotional reality is that Svensson is describing here. I mean, it's a confused, squirming mass of fear, grief, and love. I mean, that love is really the at the base of it. As painful as it is. And, this, has, yeah, grotesque. I mean, it's this the yellow eyes, the yellow eel, the yellow mud. Um, are again are all intermeshed symbolically and emotionally. We're reading all of those interlaced. And this another aspect of Freud that doesn't get mentioned in this book directly, but it indirectly is Freud's account of the death drive in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Freud's basic theory is that primary motive of life is sexual, and he described this in terms of the pleasure principle, which is basically that although we're primarily motivated by our sex drive, civilization requires that it's a repression, that it's often repressed and regulated in very strict ways. But this is all in obedience to what Freud calls the economy of the pleasure principle. Repression, short-term repression, yields longer-term maximization of pleasure for everybody. But and during World War I, Freud recognized and discovered post-traumatic stress disorders, what was called shell shock. And the spectacle of not just the mass violence of the war, but this apparent self-tormenting of the mind, returning over and over to the source of trauma. the post-traumatic stress returning to this re-inflicting pain upon itself, um, made Freud question the pleasure principle. And so he wrote these books, Beyond the Pleasure Principle and Civilization and Its Discontents, where he wondered, maybe we're not, maybe our primary goal isn't growth and perpetuating life. Maybe our primary goal is death. Maybe we're essentially aggressive, destructive creatures, fighting our sexual impulse to grow, and striving to return to the inert state of death. So the rudimentary creature would, from its very beginning, not have wanted to change and grow and evolve, um, but in the last resort, it must have been the evolution of our Earth, its relation to the sun, that left its imprint on the development of organisms. So that life grew in spite of itself, but the conservative organic instincts have absorbed these enforced alterations in the course of life and have stored them for repetition. Thus, they present the delusive appearance of forces striving after change and progress, while they're merely endeavoring to reach an old goal by ways both old and new. The final goal of all organic striving can be stated to must rather be an ancient starting point, which the living being left long ago, and to which it harks back again by all the circuitous paths of development. If we may assume, as an experience admitting of no exception, that everything living dies from causes within itself and returns to the inorganic, can say only that the goal of all life is death, and casting back, the inanimate was there before the animate. This interlacing of life and death is what Svensson describes, I think, at the end of chapter 4 in that beautiful passage I read before about the eels writhing around one another and dying and sinking to the ocean floor, while tiny see-through willow leaves floated up toward the light and let the invisible current take them. This interplay. And I think there's another beautiful passage with his dad, evoking a kind of interplay of light. In the next, light and death, light and dark, death and light, death and life. In the description of illegal fishing. So they're out on this private land, and the dad tells the boy to be scared if a train comes by, and it shines its light on them. So my boy, he recalls, I was both terrified and exhilarated. We set up our spillers faster than usual, glancing nervously at the railway, all the while poised to flee at the first distant sound of the approaching train. When it did come, it careered through the bend so much faster than I could have imagined. We turned off our flashlights and threw ourselves down in the grass. I pressed myself against the ground, doing my best to disappear among the tussocks, hiding my face and holding my breath. The train thundered past, and the whole meadow was illuminated when lightning makes time stop. And I mentioned we really were invisible, and that my dad was lying there just like me, with his hands over his face, not breathing. It's an image kind of the eels melting into the earth. Time stops. In the same way, the hibernating eel seems to suspend time. And but now the remembering Svensson, the author, writes that he thinks it was probably all staged by his dad. Now I'm thinking he was probably smiling, that he wasn't scared of being caught at all. Why would anyone care? How would they identify us? But was playing along for my benefit, that he staged the whole spectacle to make it more exciting. Maybe he was worried I would grow tired of it all otherwise. Oh, that's so sweet. So what this image of you know, dissolving into the earth, death, time stopping is actually an expression of love. And then he goes on in the next pages uh, to talk about this as a kind of ritual that's actually created his family, created his relationship to his father, who actually was not the person he thought he was. I always thought he and I were carrying on a tradition that had begun long before us, that he was doing for me what someone else had done for him. And those nights down by the river constitute some kind of continuity across time and generations, almost like a ritual. But he certainly never fished with his father, the man he called father. My grandfather, the one I called grandfather, didn't fish. Maybe Dad fished alone or with somebody else. His stories were my stories. It was as though there had been nothing before us. Was that the case? Did it start with the two of us? If so, did it have anything to do with the fact the person he called father and I grandfather was really someone else? Were our nights by the stream an attempt to compensate for something my dad hadn't had? To realize his own version of what a father and son could be to each other, a way of forging his own narrow path through life. What's at stake in Solnit's description of obliteration, weaving a pattern, a web, a forest, out of the linear narratives, violence, Ta-Nehisi Coates likewise making a kind of poetics of violence. And this interplay of life and death, Freud's Fort Dog game, this attempt to turn the experience of trauma, the unavoidable experience of trauma in life, into a pleasure of communication, into a forging of community. That's something we're always negotiating. That's what life is in a way, is this sort of tension between the forces of life and death, and that we're always, what I want to emphasize, what I think is so, what's at stake in nonfiction writing about life, is this achievement of communication, achievement of community, in the face of kind of inescapable, overwhelming pain, and the reality of death in a certain respect that's just defies representation, and yet we do it anyway, and yet we assert a concern for one another and for communicating. And that's something we're kind of now, as all too familiar with in the face of this pandemic. And viruses are, interestingly, like the eel, another really powerful, I think, example and metaphor for this tension between life and death. Viruses defy, the simple contrast between life and death, in a way that's, infinitely mysterious and mind-boggling, and just it defies the, most basic categories of our world. So, but it's the same, juxtaposition of the inorganic and the organic that, Freud was talking about in his terms. Um, and it goes, to it, obviously it structures our world now in a radical way that, is very revealing very much about the structures of our how we organize our society, social injustice, um, and but it goes, to the very basic kind of questions of the development of life. All of its evident morbidity, all of the, it's COVID causes disease and, destruction and all sorts of different kind of pain. It's testing our capacity for love, right? It's testing our capacity for social concern and compassion and growth, as a society.
Polio, influenza, Ebola, Zika, they're all caused by viruses, which are not technically alive or dead. Well, just what is a virus anyway? I'm Jim Metzner, and this is The Pulse of the Planet.
Viruses are considered to be on the edge of life. They're not living organisms, but they require to enter our cells to replicate.
Sarah McDonald is an assistant professor at the Virginia Maryland College of Veterinary Medicine and the Virginia Tech Carillion Research Institute.
Viruses are capsules with either DNA or RNA stuffed inside of them, and they're essentially inert when they're in the environment. But when they get inside of our cells, they multiply and replicate themselves hundreds of thousands of times over. So that's how virus disease is caused. It's caused by the virus replicating within our cells. So what is a virus? If it's not a living entity, what is it? It's thought to be non-living because it can't replicate by itself. It has no capacity to store or produce energy. So it requires a living entity or a living organism for it to propagate. The elements that comprise a virus are also within cells. And so the question is, which came first? Did the cell with all its molecules come first, and then the virus somehow hijacked some of these molecules from a cell and created this brand new entity that then came back and became a parasite to our cell and hijacked our cell? Or was it the reverse, whereby a virus maybe was the donor of some of these very simple molecules that the cell then utilized for its own propagation and biology?
And the answer is...
Oh, nobody knows that answer.
So, just like in Svensson's account of the eel, there are two kinds of knowledge, two kinds of knowing at stake. There's, this ultimate universal question, which came first, the virus or the cell? Like the battle between the life force and the death force. That's sort of a question for science, a question for these Promethean heroes of science like Freud and Dr. Frankenstein, and Aristotle. Well, I guess, yeah, the point about Aristotle is he admits the mystery. For Svensson, he doesn't pretend to understand it, but just supposes that the eel is a thing apart and generates spontaneously from the mud. And that's, I think, the other perspective that we always, are faced with. Whether we're talking about the eel or we're talking about, in nature in general, we're talking about the coronavirus, is the unique accidental circumstances that we face in our own lives, and how we're going to face the mystery of the accident, the way it, you know, constrains destructively the way it and the opportunities constructive, that remain nonetheless. It's that question of the love of fate, finding beauty in what is necessary, or as Thoreau puts it, the who can tell you what is left undone. Um, it's the optimism that Rebecca Solnit talks about in terms of you don't know, you can never know how things are going to play out. It's always just a question of your ability to, the strength of your faith, to imagine, to transmit into the future, um, faith and possibilities, that as yet unrealized possibilities. That's to say, I think a lesson of Svensson's book is that love, family bonds, um, are derived from disturbing mysteries that derive from pain. That's the foundation of love in a mysterious way. Um, the mysterious, the strangeness, the disturbing aspects of experience of life are what ties together. Then again, this reminds me of romantic poetry. There's another example here. The description of the ones I love the best, even the dearest that I loved the best, are strange, nay, rather stranger than the rest. Um, I think that's something really deeply true, and more importantly, this is a lesson of the book. Become more familiar again. Those two senses of knowing as familiarity, and know versus knowing as objective knowledge, knowing facts. Um, they work in diametrically opposed ways. So the more we love someone, the more intimate we are, intimately familiar. Um, I think the more strangeness we're exposed to. That's a weird and maybe kind of tragic thing to say, but I think if you think about your deepest relationships, family relationships, isn't it true that they're also the most challenging and the most surprising? Um, and I think that's a real deep lesson, a paradoxical lesson, that again we require metaphors like the eel to negotiate rather than understand.